My father did not walk me down the aisle because my golden sister had a party. He ran away from the wedding and went to her. Hello, Reddit. Before I start, I just want to ask you to support this post. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Not many people read to the end, and I'd really love to hear what you think. I'm 30 years old, and my life has always felt like a competition I never even signed up for. The only problem? I was never the one winning. I have a younger sister, Emma. She's 28. She was my father's favorite. A straight-A student, student government president, debate team champion, volunteer. Her list of achievements was endless. And me? I was just there. The background character in the story of her greatness. Any success I had was immediately overshadowed by whatever she did. If she got a perfect 10, it was amazing. If I got a 9, it was, you could have done better. I played sports, participated in clubs, had decent grades, but none of it mattered. I could have won a Nobel Prize, and my father would still say, "Oh, but did you see how Emma dominated her debate tournament last week?" Since childhood, I understood that my father's attention belonged to her. If I wanted even a sliver of it, I had to do something extraordinary. But even then, there were no guarantees. I still remember the day I won first place in a citywide math competition in school. I was ecstatic. It was a huge win for me. I ran home with my diploma, expecting at least some recognition. My father glanced at it and shrugged. "That's nice, but Emma just made it to the national debate finals. Now that's impressive." And that's how it always was. Eventually, I stopped trying. I was exhausted from proving myself to people who never really saw me. At school, I was Mr. Johnson's son and Emma's brother. At home, I was the one who wasn't as brilliant as she was. My mom was a little different. She wasn't as extreme as my dad, but she never really stood up for me either. If I ever mentioned that Emma got all the attention, she'd just say, "She's younger, she needs support." As if I didn't. The only one who truly loved me unconditionally was my dog, Max. I rescued him from a shelter when I was in college. No matter how bad my day was, he was always there, tail wagging, happy to see me. He was the only real comfort I had in a family where I felt invisible. When I started college, I thought that maybe things would change. I wasn't expecting my father to suddenly become my biggest fan, but I hoped that moving forward in life, stepping into adulthood, would finally make him see me as an individual, not just Emma's less accomplished brother. But, as always, Emma's achievements overshadowed mine before I even had the chance to celebrate my own. The day I left for college, my dad barely acknowledged it. He gave me a distracted nod, said something generic about working hard, and then turned his attention back to Emma, who had just gotten a promotion at her part-time job. It wasn't even anything major, just a small bump in responsibilities at the cafe she worked at after school. But you'd think she had just landed a spot in the White House with the way my father gushed over her. Meanwhile, I was packing up my things, moving into a dorm, starting a new chapter of my life, and it barely registered for him. 4 years later, my graduation was supposed to be one of the biggest days of my life. I had worked hard, pushed myself, and earned my degree. I had imagined what it would feel like to walk across that stage, to hear my name called, and to see my family in the crowd. My mom was there, of course, along with a few other relatives. But my dad? He wasn't. He had flown out with Emma for a national debate tournament. He didn't even call to congratulate me until the next day, and even then, it was just a quick, "Hey, good job," before he pivoted the conversation to how amazing Emma had been on stage, how she had completely destroyed the opposing team, how proud he was of her. My accomplishment was reduced to a footnote in a conversation that wasn't even about me. I tried not to let it get to me, but it was hard. Every single time I did something worth celebrating, Emma somehow managed to take the spotlight, whether she meant to or not. And my father was always right there, elevating her, making sure she felt special while I was left in the background, watching from the sidelines. Even outside of academics, it was the same pattern. At one point, I got into photography. It was something that made me feel good, something that gave me a sense of identity beyond the family dynamic I had always been stuck in. I started taking pictures seriously, built up a small portfolio, and eventually got my work displayed at a local coffee shop. It was a big deal for me, my art, my vision, being seen by others. My mom stopped by and told me she loved my photos, which meant a lot. But my father? He didn't have time. I had asked him to drop by more than once. The coffee shop was only a few minutes from his office, and my photos were up for weeks. He kept saying he would try, but he never did. And the worst part? He wasn't too busy. He just didn't care. During that same time, he somehow found the time to drive across town to see Emma give a presentation at her internship. He took pictures, praised her for being such a natural speaker, and told everyone how proud he was of her. But when it came to me, my accomplishments didn't even warrant a few minutes of his time. It wasn't just frustrating, it was exhausting. I kept trying, hoping that maybe, Just once, I would be enough. But the message was always clear. No matter what I did, no matter how much effort I put in, my father always chose Emma. When I announced my engagement to Ryan, my dad, Greg, suddenly decided to take an interest in my life in a way he never had before. It was almost surreal. The same man who had ignored my graduation, who hadn't even bothered to see my photography, who had chosen my sister over me every single time, was now offering to pay for half of my wedding. Not only that, but he promised to walk me down the aisle, saying it was every father's duty. At first, I was stunned. This was the same man who had spent my entire life acting as if I were an afterthought. And now he was stepping up? I should have been happy, right? I should have taken it as a sign that maybe, just maybe, he had finally realized how much he had hurt me over the years and was trying to make up for it. But it felt off. It was too sudden, too out of character. He had never been the kind of father who cared about my milestones. So why this one? It wasn't just about the money, though that was shocking enough coming from him. It was the way he suddenly started acting like he had always been involved in my life. He was calling more often, asking about wedding details, making suggestions, even talking about how proud he was. It didn't add up. Ryan was the first to say it. "Babe, doesn't this feel a little weird?" he asked one night while we were going over the guest list. "I mean, no offense, but your dad's never cared before. Why now?" I knew he had a point. Deep down, I felt it too. But I wanted so badly to believe that maybe, for once, my dad was doing something because he actually wanted to be there for me. Maybe he had regrets. Maybe he was trying to fix things before it was too late. I wasn't naive. I knew who he was, but I still had that small, stupid hope that he had finally seen me. So, against my better judgment, I chose to believe in the best. I told Ryan he was probably overthinking it, that maybe my dad had just realized he needed to step up. And despite the doubt gnawing at the back of my mind, I let myself believe, just for a little while, that this time would be different. A week before the wedding, my father called me. I could tell from the tone in his voice that something was off, but I wasn't prepared for what he was about to say. "I can't do it," he said, just like that. No build-up, no apology, nothing. Just a flat, matter-of-fact statement. For a second, I didn't even understand what he meant. "Can't do what?" I asked, my stomach already tightening. "The wedding," he said, like it was the most normal thing in the world. "I can't walk you down the aisle." I went completely silent. My ears started ringing, and for a moment, I thought I had misheard him. After all the calls, after all the sudden interest, after promising to be there, he was backing out? Why? I finally forced out, my throat dry. There was a pause, and then he said it. "Emma is having her housewarming party that day. She needs me more." I almost dropped my phone. It wasn't a joke. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't testing me. He was completely serious. My sister, who had just moved into a new apartment, had decided to throw a party. And that, in my father's mind, was more important than walking his daughter down the aisle on her wedding day. I don't even know how long I stayed quiet before I finally managed to speak. "Dad, are you serious?" I asked, my voice shaking. "You're ditching my wedding for a housewarming party?" "She asked first," he said, as if that somehow made it okay. "And you've always been independent. You can handle it." That was it. That was his reasoning. Not an apology, not an ounce of guilt, just a simple reminder that I had learned how to survive without him. So why should he start being there for me now? I wanted to scream, to cry, to demand that he explain to me how he could do this. But I already knew the answer. It had always been this way. Emma came first, no matter what. My feelings didn't matter, my milestones didn't matter, because to him, I was always the one who could handle it. I didn't even have the strength to argue. "Okay," I said. That was all. Then I hung up. I sat there, staring at the phone, feeling this crushing weight settle in my chest. It wasn't just about the wedding. It was everything. Years of being overlooked, dismissed, put second. Years of hoping, deep down, that one day my father would finally see me. And now I knew, without a doubt, that he never would. I didn't want to walk down the aisle alone. I had spent too many years feeling like I had to do everything by myself. And on this day, I didn't want to carry that burden. I refused to let my father's absence ruin one of the most important moments of my life. So, after sitting with my emotions for a while, I picked up my phone and dialed my Uncle Stephen's number. Stephen was my father's younger brother, but in reality, he had always been more of a father to me than Greg ever was. He came to my school events when my dad couldn't be bothered. He cheered me on when I achieved something, even if it wasn't groundbreaking. When I got Max, my dog, in college, it was Stephen who helped me with vet visits and training, always showing up when I needed support. He wasn't overbearing about it. He just cared, and he never made me feel like I had to fight for his attention. The phone barely rang before he answered. "Hey, kiddo, excited for the big day?" Just hearing his voice made me feel a little steadier. But when I opened my mouth, my voice cracked. "Uncle Steve." Dad backed out. Silence. Then a sharp inhale. What? I swallowed hard, hating how raw I felt. He said Emma's housewarming party is the same day, and she needs him more. I could hear the disbelief in his voice. You've got to be kidding me. I let out a bitter laugh. I wish I was. There was a beat of silence. Then his tone shifted, firm, certain, like he had already made up his mind. Of course, I'll walk you down the aisle. Just like that. No hesitation. No second thoughts. I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear those words until that moment. Tears welled in my eyes. But this time, they weren't from hurt. They were from relief. Really? I whispered. Of course, he repeated. I would be honored. And that was it. That was the difference between Stephen and Greg. My father had always made me feel like a burden, like an afterthought. Stephen made me feel wanted. Important. For the first time since my dad's call, I felt like everything was going to be okay. The next morning, I woke up to my phone vibrating nonstop. 15 missed calls from my father, 7 from my sister, and 23 messages that became increasingly aggressive with each one. The first few were predictable, short, guilt-tripping texts meant to make me feel like I was the one in the wrong. He told me I was being dramatic, that Emma was my sister, and I should support her instead of making this about myself. He insisted that my wedding was just one day, but Emma was starting a new life in her new home, and he had expected me to be mature enough to understand that. Then the tone shifted, and the messages turned hostile. He demanded to know how I could dare put Uncle Steve in his place, asking if I had any idea how humiliating this was for him. He told me I had ruined our family and called me a selfish woman. By the time I reached the last few messages, they had devolved into a full-blown rant about how I had always played the victim and how he was done with my attitude. I stared at my phone, my fingers tightening around it as I debated what to do. I had expected him to be upset, but I had foolishly hoped that he would at least have the decency to accept the consequences of his own actions. I thought he might ignore it, maybe send some passive-aggressive remark, but I had underestimated his ego. Before I could even put the phone down, it started ringing again. I let it vibrate in my hand for a few moments, knowing exactly how this conversation was going to go. Against my better judgment, I answered. The second I picked up, my father's voice exploded through the speaker so loudly that Max, who had been curled up beside me, jumped in alarm and pressed himself against my side, his ears flattened. My father was screaming, demanding to know what was wrong with me, accusing me of replacing him with Steve just to embarrass him. His voice was raw with rage, and it was so intense that for a moment, I just sat there, gripping the phone, listening to him rant as if I had personally committed some unforgivable crime against him. I took a slow breath, trying to steady myself, but my hands were already shaking. When I finally spoke, my voice came out colder than I had expected. I told him that he had chosen not to be there, that I had not replaced him, but simply accepted the reality he had created. That only made him angrier. He shouted that I did not get to decide that he was my father, not Steve, and that I should have rescheduled my wedding if I actually cared about the family. A sharp, humorless laugh escaped me before I could stop it. I asked him if he was seriously expecting me to change the date of my wedding just because Emma had decided to throw a housewarming party. He snapped back that Emma needed him, that she did not have anyone else, and that I should understand. I felt something inside me harden at his words. I asked him if he had ever stopped to consider that maybe I needed him too, that maybe I had needed him my entire life, but had learned not to expect anything from him, because he had always chosen Emma first. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a deep inhale, a moment where I could almost hear him struggling to find the right words. Then he scoffed and said that I had always needed to make myself the victim, that I was blowing this out of proportion just to spite him. I clenched my jaw, feeling the weight of years of disappointment settle into something solid, something final. I told him to enjoy Emma's party and that I hoped it was worth losing his daughter over. Before he could say anything else, I hung up. Max, still tense from the shouting, whined softly and nudged my arm with his nose, his warm weight grounding me in reality. I ran a hand over his fur, exhaling slowly as I let the moment sink in. I had always known this would happen. Deep down, I had always known exactly who my father was, but this time, I would not let it break me. The morning of my wedding was calm, filled with a quiet kind of joy that I had never experienced before. There was no tension, no walking on eggshells, no fear of being overshadowed. I was surrounded only by the people who truly cared about me, and for the first time in a long while, I felt completely at peace. Uncle Steve arrived early, as I knew he would. He had always been dependable, always showing up when I needed him, and today was no different. As I was getting ready, he knocked on the door and handed me a small box, his expression warm but slightly nervous. When I opened it, I found a silver bracelet inside, delicate yet sturdy, with an engraving that read, "Always by my side." I barely held back the tears as I fastened it around my wrist. I looked up at him, speechless for a moment, before finally managing to whisper, "Thank you." He gave my hand a squeeze and told me that it was never a question for him, that he had always been proud to stand by me, whether my father chose to or not. My mother came to the wedding, but she arrived alone. There was no last-minute change of heart, no sudden appearance of my father or sister trying to mend things before it was too late. I think a small part of me had been bracing for the possibility that they would show up and cause a scene, but deep down, I knew better. Greg was too stubborn, too wrapped up in his own sense of pride to admit he had made a mistake. Emma had probably expected me to crumble without their presence, and maybe years ago, I would have. But standing there, surrounded by love and genuine happiness, I felt nothing but relief that they were not there to cast a shadow over my day. The ceremony was beautiful. Ryan looked at me like I was the only person in the world, and as I walked down the aisle with Uncle Steve by my side, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the people who had shown up for me, for the love that filled the room, for the fact that I was no longer waiting for validation from those who had never truly given it. While I was celebrating, while I was dancing with my husband and laughing with friends and feeling lighter than I had in years, Emma was sitting alone in an empty apartment. Most of our relatives had refused to attend her party, seeing it for exactly what it was, a petty attempt to steal the spotlight. She had spent so much of her life believing that she was the center of everything, that my father would always prioritize her, that everyone would fall in line like they always had. But this time, they didn't. She had chosen to exclude herself, just like our father had. And for the first time in my life, I realized that their absence was not a loss. It was a gift. A few weeks after the wedding, life had finally settled into a peaceful rhythm. Ryan and I were enjoying the quiet that followed all the chaos, and for the first time in a long time, I felt free from the weight of my father's disappointment. I had built my own life, surrounded by people who truly cared about me, and I had no regrets about the way things had turned out. One evening, I was at Uncle Steve's house for dinner. His wife, Aunt Diane, had always been kind to me, and the three of us were sitting in their cozy kitchen, sharing stories and laughing over old memories. The atmosphere was light and warm, the kind of family setting I had always craved. Then, in the middle of a casual conversation about my childhood, Diane absent-mindedly said something that made my entire world shift. "Steve has always had a special connection with you, ever since your mom was single." The moment the words left her mouth, she froze, realizing what she had just said. Steve's entire body tensed, and the room, which had been filled with easy laughter just seconds before, went completely silent. My heart started pounding as I processed what she had just let slip. I frowned, my brain struggling to piece together the implications. "What do you mean, since my mom was single?" I asked slowly, my voice carefully measured. Diane's eyes darted to Steve, who exhaled heavily and rubbed a hand over his face. There was a long pause before he finally spoke. "You deserve to know the truth," he said quietly. I sat there, gripping the edge of the table, as he revealed a truth that had been buried for 30 years. Back when my parents were newly married, my father, Greg, had been completely consumed by his job, working long hours, rarely home, always chasing the next big promotion. My mother, feeling lonely and neglected, had turned to the one person who was always there, Steve. What started as emotional support had eventually turned into something more. An affair. I felt my stomach drop as everything began to make sense. The way my father had always been distant, the way he had never truly connected with me, the way he had chosen Emma over me at every turn. It was not just favoritism or neglect, it was resentment. I was a constant reminder of a time in his life that he wanted to erase. I swallowed hard, my mind spinning. "So, does that mean?" Steve hesitated before nodding, his expression unreadable. "We never did a test, but your father always had his doubts. And looking at you, I've always had mine too." The weight of his words crashed down on me. I had spent my whole life trying to earn my father's love, trying to understand why he had always treated me as if I were an outsider in my own family. And now, I had my answer. It was because, to him, I had never really been his. I sat there in stunned silence, staring at the man who had been more of a father to me than Greg ever was, realizing that maybe, just maybe, he actually was. I couldn't let it go. The thought had settled in my mind like a storm cloud, refusing to clear. I had spent my entire life wondering why my father treated me like I was barely there, why he had always chosen Emma over me, why I had never been enough. And now, suddenly, there was an explanation I had never even considered. The idea that Steve could actually be my real father was too big to ignore. A few days after Diane's accidental confession, I met with Steve alone. We sat on a bench in a quiet park, the autumn air crisp around us. My heart was pounding so hard I thought he might hear it. I took a deep breath, my hands gripping my knees. I need to ask you something, and I need the truth, I said, my voice steady despite the chaos in my head. Could you be my real father? Steve exhaled slowly, his gaze thoughtful, as if he had been expecting this. He nodded slightly before speaking. I understand why you're asking, he said gently. And I won't lie to you. Your mother and we were together, briefly, a long time ago, when she and Greg were having problems. But I promise you, you are biologically Greg's daughter. Something inside me unclenched, but at the same time, I felt a strange sense of loss. I didn't know what answer I had been hoping for. If he had said yes, it would have made sense in a way. It would have explained everything. But at the same time, it would have shattered everything I thought I knew about my own life. I let out a shaky breath. Then why? I asked. Why have you always been there for me when Greg never was? Steve's expression softened, and he reached over, placing a firm hand on mine. Because I saw the way he treated you, he said. I saw how he overlooked you, how he favored Emma, how he made you feel like you had to fight for a place in your own family. And I couldn't stand by and watch that happen. I swallowed hard, emotions tightening my throat. So you stepped in. He nodded, not as a replacement, but as someone who actually saw you, someone who cared. You deserved better than what Greg gave you, and if I could be there for you in even a small way, I wasn't going to turn my back on you. Tears blurred my vision, but I refused to let them fall. For years, I had felt like I was chasing something I would never catch, like I was trying to prove my worth to a man who would never see me as enough. And all along, there had been someone quietly standing beside me, making sure I never had to do it alone. I squeezed his hand. Thank you, I whispered, and for the first time in my life, I truly meant it. I knew I had to confront my father. There were too many unanswered questions, too much left unsaid, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of what he might say. I wasn't looking for his approval anymore. I wasn't hoping for him to finally see me. I just wanted closure. I sent him a message asking him to meet me at a small cafe near his office. He agreed, though his response was short and cold, as if he was doing me a favor by even acknowledging my request. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting stiffly with his arms crossed over his chest. His expression was unreadable, but the tension in his shoulders told me everything I needed to know. The moment I sat down, he started. He accused me of humiliating him in front of the family, of making a spectacle out of his absence at my wedding, of choosing to embarrass him by having Uncle Steve walk me down the aisle. He said I had turned people against him, that I had made myself look like a victim just to make him seem like the villain. I let him speak. I listened to every word, not because I believed any of it, but because I wanted him to have no excuse when I finally said what I had come there to say. When he finally paused long enough for me to get a word in, I looked him straight in the eye and said calmly, I know about Mom and Steve. His entire body stiffened. The color drained from his face so fast that for a second, I thought he might actually pass out. His mouth opened slightly as if he wanted to deny it, but no words came out. For the first time in my life, my father was silent. I let the weight of that moment settle between us before I continued. I told him that I understood now why he had always been so distant, why he had never been able to love me the way he loved Emma, why I had always felt like an outsider in my own family. But then I made it clear that his emotional problems were not my fault. His bitterness, his resentment, his inability to separate his past from his present, that was all on him. I told him that I had spent years trying to be enough for him, trying to win his approval, trying to understand why I was never his priority. But I was done. I would not allow myself to be a victim of his resentment anymore. He didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. He didn't even look at me. When I stood up to leave, I didn't feel anger or sadness or even relief. I just felt free. For a long moment, my father just sat there in silence. He looked down at the table, his hands clenched together, his jaw tight, like he was forcing himself to stay composed. I had never seen him like this before, completely at a loss for words, with no anger to hide behind, no excuses to throw in my face. Then, finally, he exhaled and said, I didn't know how to deal with it, so I just pulled away from you. His voice was quieter than I had ever heard it, like he was speaking more to himself than to me. I studied his face, waiting for more, waiting for him to take responsibility, to say something that would change the way I felt, but nothing else came. No apology, no promise to fix things, just that single admission. It should have meant something. It should have felt like a victory after all these years. But it didn't. I nodded slowly, letting his words sink in before I spoke. You can be a part of my life, but on my terms. If not, I won't wait any longer. My voice was steady, certain. I had spent too much of my life waiting for him to change, waiting for him to see me, waiting for him to be the father I needed. I wasn't going to do it anymore. The choice was his now. He didn't say anything as I stood up, and I didn't wait for him to. Whatever he decided, I knew I would be fine either way. I stepped out of the cafe, feeling the crisp air hit my face, feeling lighter than I had in years. Max trotted beside me, his tail wagging as if he sensed the shift in me, as if he knew that I had finally let go of something that had weighed me down for far too long. As we walked away, I realized that I no longer needed the approval of those who never valued me. I had built a life without it, and I was finally free. 2 weeks passed without a word from my father. I wasn't waiting for a response, and I wasn't holding my breath for an apology. For the first time in my life, I wasn't looking to him for anything. I had said what I needed to say, and whether he chose to be part of my life or not, I knew I would be fine. Then, one evening, a package arrived at my doorstep. It had no return address, but I knew immediately who it was from. I brought it inside, my hand steady as I unwrapped the brown paper. Inside was an old photo album, one I had never seen before. I opened it slowly, flipping through pages filled with pictures of me as a child, laughing on the swings, blowing out birthday candles, curled up asleep with Max as a puppy. Tucked between the pages was a small note, written in my father's unmistakable handwriting. I was there, but I didn't notice the main thing. "I'm sorry." I stared at the words for a long time, reading them over and over, trying to understand what I felt. It wasn't a perfect resolution, and it wasn't the grand moment of redemption that some part of me had once wished for. But it was something. It was an acknowledgement, however small, that he had finally seen what he had ignored for so long. I closed the album and set it aside, knowing that while it wouldn't erase the past, it was at least a beginning. Life moved forward, and so did I. I no longer spent my days searching for approval from people who had never truly valued me. I had a husband who loved me, a real family that I had built for myself, and Max, who had always been by my side through everything. I had finally stopped waiting for the love I had never received. Because the truth was, I had found it elsewhere. And that was enough. I had let myself believe, even if only for a moment, that things might finally start to get better. After my father sent me the photo album and the note, I thought that maybe, just maybe, he had taken a step toward change. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was more than I had ever expected from him. I had allowed myself to think that we might reach some kind of fragile peace, not closeness, but at least an understanding. Then, a month later, I received a subpoena. At first, I thought there had to be some mistake. I reread the document, trying to make sense of what I was looking at, but the reality of it sank in quickly. Greg had decided to contest the inheritance left to me by my grandmother, my father's own mother. She had passed away a few months before my wedding, and in her will, she had left me a significant portion of her estate. I had always been close to her. Unlike my father, she had never treated me as second best, had never made me feel like I needed to prove my worth. She had always made it clear that she saw me, that she cared about me, and when I was younger, her home had been one of the only places where I felt truly welcome. Apparently, Greg had decided that was unacceptable. I sat at the kitchen table, reading through the legal jargon, feeling the familiar weight of betrayal settle into my chest. The document spelled it out in cold, formal language. Greg was arguing that I was not entitled to the money, that Emma deserved more, that I had always been an outsider and therefore had no right to claim anything from the family. I felt sick. After everything, after the years of indifference, after choosing Emma over me at every turn, after refusing to walk me down the aisle, after finally admitting that he had pulled away from me on purpose, this was his next move. It wasn't about reconciliation. It never had been. The photo album, the note, the quiet acknowledgement of the past, it was all meaningless. Maybe it had been guilt, or maybe it had just been a way to lull me into thinking he had changed. But now I saw the truth. I didn't know if this was driven by resentment, by greed, or by some twisted sense of loyalty to Emma. Maybe it was all of those things. But one thing was clear. This was going to be a long battle. I knew I couldn't handle this alone, so I hired a lawyer, Kate Anderson, a woman known for being relentless in the courtroom. She had come highly recommended, and the moment I sat down with her, I understood why. She wasted no time going through the case, flipping through the documents with sharp efficiency, her expression unreadable as she took in the details of Greg's claim. When she finally set the papers down and looked at me, her voice was calm but firm. "This is pure manipulation," she said. "Your father knows he has no real case, but he wants to use the court system to pressure you into giving him what he wants. He's banking on you not wanting a legal fight." I let out a slow breath, nodding. "So what do we do?" Kate gave a small, knowing smile, the kind that told me she had handled far worse. "We fight." Greg and his lawyer had filed a statement claiming that I had not been close enough to my grandmother to receive the inheritance, arguing that our relationship had been distant and that there was no reason for her to leave me such a significant portion of her estate. The sheer audacity of that claim made my blood boil. My grandmother had been one of the only people in my family who had ever truly cared about me, and now my father was trying to rewrite history just to line his own pockets. As if that wasn't enough, they had also taken things a step further, arguing that my grandmother had been mentally unstable at the time she wrote the will. They claimed she had been easily influenced, and that her decisions should be considered invalid. I couldn't believe it. This wasn't just about me anymore. Greg was willing to tarnish my grandmother's name, to paint her as incompetent, just to get what he wanted. The same woman he had spent his life respecting, the same woman he had called sharp as ever just months before her passing. He was now arguing that she hadn't been in her right mind. If there had been any part of me that still wanted to believe there was something redeemable about my father, that part was gone now. This was not just greed. This was calculated, cruel, and completely shameless. Kate leaned back in her chair, tapping a pen against the table as she studied me. "I need to ask you this now," she said. "Are you ready for a fight? Because this won't be over quickly, and your father is counting on you wanting to settle." I didn't hesitate. "I'm not giving him anything." Kate nodded, satisfied. "Good. Then let's make sure he regrets ever trying this." Kate wasted no time building our case. She was as relentless as she had promised to be, gathering indisputable evidence that would dismantle Greg's claims piece by piece. While he was trying to rewrite history, we were making sure the truth would be impossible to ignore. She collected testimony from my grandmother's closest friends, elderly women who had known her for decades. They gave sworn statements confirming that my grandmother had deliberately left me a portion of her inheritance because she wanted to, because she had always seen me as someone who truly cared for her. Some of them even mentioned that she had confided in them about her concerns regarding Greg, how she didn't trust him, how she had grown tired of his selfishness over the years. But the strongest piece of evidence came in the form of phone records. Kate had gone through months of my grandmother's call history and found multiple recorded voicemails where she explicitly stated her reasoning for excluding Greg from a larger portion of the inheritance. In one of them, she told a friend in no uncertain terms, "I love my son, but I don't trust him with money. And the way he has treated Zoe her whole life. I won't reward that behavior." If that wasn't enough, Kate managed to uncover something even more damning. A home security camera video from my grandmother's house, taken just a few months before she passed away. The video showed her sitting in her favorite armchair, chatting with one of her neighbors who had come to visit. The footage was crystal clear, her voice steady as she spoke. "I'm leaving this to Zoe because she's always been there for me," my grandmother said. "She never asked for anything, never expected anything, but she deserves it. I know Greg won't like it, but that's his problem, not mine." When that evidence was presented in court, I saw the shift immediately. The judge, who had been neutral up until this point, suddenly began to doubt Greg's words. His entire argument had been built on the claim that my grandmother had been mentally unstable, that she hadn't known what she was doing when she wrote her will. But here she was, speaking clearly, rationally, making it obvious that her decision had been entirely her own. Greg's lawyer tried to argue that the video could have been taken under pressure, but the judge wasn't buying it. The more they pushed, the weaker their case became. Greg, who had been so confident walking into that courtroom, was now visibly uncomfortable. He had never expected his own mother's words to be used against him. He had spent so much of his life believing he could manipulate reality to fit his version of events. But this time, the truth was staring him right in the face. And the judge was paying attention. Greg must have realized that his case was slipping through his fingers because instead of fighting me directly, he decided to act through Emma. And, of course, she was more than willing to play her part. If there was one thing Emma had always excelled at, it was twisting a situation to benefit herself, and this time was no different. She filed an affidavit claiming that I had manipulated our grandmother into giving me the inheritance, stating that I had used my emotional tactics to convince her to cut Greg out. She painted herself as the concerned daughter who had just discovered the truth, pretending that she had been unaware of my so-called scheming until now. It was laughable, considering she had barely spoken to our grandmother in her final years, but Emma had always been a master of deceit. Then, she took it a step further. She presented letters, supposedly written by my grandmother, expressing doubts about me, suggesting that she had felt pressured into leaving me the inheritance. The documents were vague but carefully crafted, as if designed to create just enough suspicion to sway the court in Greg's favor. They were old, yellowed at the edges, and written in what, at first glance, looked like my grandmother's handwriting. But Kate was ready for this. She immediately requested a forensic handwriting analysis, and within days, the results came back. The letters were fake. The expert broke it down in court, pointing out the inconsistencies, the subtle differences in pressure and stroke patterns, the tiny details that proved without a doubt that the letters had been fabricated. When the results were announced, I stole a glance at Emma, expecting her to look at least a little rattled, but she sat there stone-faced, as if she had already convinced herself of her own lies. Greg's lawyer tried to recover, but the damage was done. Emma had been their key witness, their emotional appeal to the court, and now she had been exposed as a fraud. The judge was already skeptical of Greg's case, but after this, I could see it in his expression. He was done entertaining their nonsense. Greg and Emma had spent their entire lives believing they could manipulate reality to fit their own narrative, that they could twist the truth and get away with it. But now, for the first time, their lies were unraveling in front of them, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. After 9 months of hearings, countless exhibits, and hours of testimony, the court finally reached its decision. The tension in the courtroom was thick as everyone waited for the judge to speak. I sat with Kate beside me, my hands clasped tightly together, my heart pounding in my chest. Across the room, Greg and Emma sat stiffly, their expressions unreadable, though I could see the tension in Greg's clenched jaw and Emma's rigid posture. The judge cleared his throat and began reading the ruling, his voice steady and firm. The will remained valid. I would receive my rightful share of the inheritance, just as my grandmother had intended. There was no ambiguity, no loophole left for Greg to exploit. Her decision stood, and there was nothing he could do about it. Then came the part that neither Greg nor Emma had been expecting. For submitting false evidence, both of them were fined. The fake letters, the baseless accusations, the blatant attempt to deceive the court had not only failed, but had backfired spectacularly. The judge made it clear that their actions had been both unethical and illegal, and they would face financial penalties as a result. Greg also lost the right to contest the will in the future. This was, without a doubt, the most humiliating outcome for him. He had spent months dragging me through a legal battle, convinced that he could strong-arm the court into giving him what he wanted. Instead, the law had shut him down completely. He would never get another chance to challenge my grandmother's decision. And to top it all off, the judge ordered Greg to pay all court costs. Every legal fee, every filing expense, every dollar spent fighting this ridiculous case, it was all on him now. I risked a glance in his direction, just in time to see the reality of it hit him. His face, normally composed, was tight with barely contained rage. His hands were clenched into fists, and for the first time in my life, I saw something I had never seen in my father before. Defeat. Greg had spent his entire life believing he had the power, that he could control any situation, that his word was final. But now, sitting in that courtroom, stripped of his authority and left with nothing, he finally understood that he had lost. Emma, always the perfect actress, tried to maintain her composure, but I could see the flicker of shock in her eyes. She had always been on the winning side. She had always been the one favored, the one protected. But now, for the first time, she had bet on the wrong side. As the judge wrapped up the ruling, Kate leaned toward me and whispered, "It's over." And for the first time in a long time, I finally felt it too. After the trial, Greg tried to contact me. Maybe he thought that after everything, after months of court battles, I would somehow still be willing to listen. Maybe he assumed that, as always, I would be the one to smooth things over, to let go of everything just to keep the peace. But that part of me was gone. I didn't need his approval anymore, and I certainly didn't need his presence in my life. I blocked his number without hesitation. That should have been the end of it, but he made one last attempt. A letter arrived in the mail, written in his usual sharp, precise handwriting. I almost didn't open it, but curiosity got the better of me. I didn't want it to be like this, the letter read. There were more words, carefully chosen, sentences crafted to sound regretful, without actually admitting to anything. It was full of vague sentiments about how he had only done what he thought was right, how he had made mistakes but still wanted to be part of my life, how Emma needed me to let this go for the sake of the family. There was nothing real in it. No true apology, no acknowledgement of the damage he had done, no sign that he had actually changed. But it didn't matter anymore. As I sat there reading his words, Max curled up on my lap, breathing steadily as if he could sense that I needed the comfort. Ryan was in the next room, talking to Uncle Steve about plans for the weekend. I could hear their voices, their laughter, the sound of the life I had built for myself. This was my family now. The people who had stood by me, who had chosen me, who had never made me feel like I had to fight for their love. I looked at the letter one last time, then tore it into pieces and threw it in the trash. I had spent my entire life chasing something that had never been real. Now, for the first time, I was free. I was no longer his daughter. And that was fine with me. So, what do you think, Reddit? Would you have given him another chance, or would you have cut him off just like I did? Let me know in the comments, because I know this isn't a simple situation. Would you ever forgive someone like that? Or is there a point where some people just don't deserve another chance?